The heat hit her first. It came in waves, the kind that rose from the desert ground and shimmered in the air like ghosts. The moment her boots touched the tarmac of the forward operating base, the breath in her chest thickened as though she'd swallowed fire. The desert didn't welcome strangers. It tested them. She shifted her weight. The massive Barrett M82 balanced across her shoulder like a steel cross. The rifle seemed to swallow half her frame, longer than her arm span and heavy. Enough that any man would have grimaced carrying it from the aircraft to the gate. She didn't grimace. Her stride was steady, her pace unhurried. She moved with the calm of someone who had already accepted the desert's challenge. Around her, soldiers in sun-bleached uniforms paused in their work. Mechanics paused with oily. Rags in hand, clerks stopped mid-step, and a group of infantrymen leaning on a Humvee lifted their heads almost in unison. Silence spread in ripples as the sight of her, framed against the blazing sky, reached them. At first, the silence wasn't respect. It was confusion, then amusement. A Barrett M82 wasn't the sort of weapon you expected to see slung across a woman's shoulder. Most men struggled to haul it, even with years of combat muscle hardened into their frames. Yet here she was, compact, deliberate, carrying it with a composure that mocked their disbelief. She's going to drop it before she makes it to the gate, one soldier muttered, half laughing. His buddy smirked, raising a hand to shade his eyes from the glare. Looks like she's carrying it for someone else. Maybe the real shooter's behind her. But there was no one behind her. Just the shimmer of heat and the faint echo of rotors fading into the horizon. She didn't break stride as she passed them. Didn't acknowledge the words, the looks, or the chuckles. The Barrett's shadow stretched beside her, a black line, drawn across the earth. Inside the gate, a corporal assigned to intake approached, clipboard in hand. His jaw tightened slightly as he glanced from her face to the weapon. Name? He asked, though his tone made it clear. He thought he already understood what she was. Just another body in a long list of replacements. Staff Sergeant Kincaid. She replied, her voice even, carrying no strain, despite the weight on her shoulder. The corporal blinked, pen hovering for a second before scratching the name down. His eyes flicked to the Barrett again. That yours? She tilted her chin. In a small nod. He smirked, but it wasn't unkind. Hell of a choice. It's not a choice, she said simply. Then she signed the paperwork, handed it back, and kept moving. As she made her way toward the barracks, the whispers followed. Some subtle, some not. Jesus, she's smaller than my kid sister. Bet she can't even load that thing without help. Command must be desperate, sending her here. She heard it all, though her face betrayed nothing. Words didn't pierce her. They simply slid off like sand against stone. She had heard worse in training, felt heavier doubt during selection. Doubt had been a constant companion, and she had long since learned how to turn it into silence. The barracks themselves were nothing to remember. Rows of weathered metal containers stacked together, their insides transformed into barely livable bunks. Dust coated the steps and clung to the boots of every soldier who trudged in and out. She set her gear down quietly, the Barrett resting with deliberate care against the wall beside her cot. Two soldiers across the room glanced at her, then at each other, grinning like boys in a schoolyard. You know what that is? One asked, pointing with his chin toward the Barrett. Yeah, his friend said with a smirk. It's a prop. She didn't reply. She sat on the cot, unzipped her duffel, and began methodically organizing the contents. Each motion was precise, efficient, practiced. Her rifle kit, her cleaning tools, the folded cloth she used to wrap the Barrett's scope. None of it was hurried. She moved as though the noise around her didn't exist. It was the silence that unnerved them more than her presence. Soldiers were used to banter, to challenges thrown back and forth, to newcomers defending themselves with sharp tongues. But she offered nothing, no explanation, no retort, not even a glance. Her silence pressed against the room, until it felt heavier than the weapon she had carried, and by evening, the desert cooled. Shadows stretched long across the base, and the smell of diesel fuel mingled with dust in the air. She sat on the steps outside the barracks, Barrett across her knees. Her hands moved over the weapon in slow, deliberate motions, checking the action, wiping down the receiver, testing the bipod. To her, it wasn't ritual, it was necessity. From the corner of her eye, she saw them watching again. The same men who had laughed when she arrived now stood at a distance, curiosity winning over mockery. "She's serious about it," one whispered. "Yeah, but serious doesn't mean she can shoot." They didn't know. Couldn't know. Not yet. She closed the dust cover, adjusted the sling, and lifted the Barrett once more. The weapon settled against her shoulder with the familiarity of an old friend. Her eyes lifted to the horizon beyond the wire fences, where mountains loomed. In the last light of day, somewhere out there, enemies waited. Somewhere out there, someone was already sighting down their scope, patient, deadly, watching, and when that moment came, she wouldn't need words. She would only need one shot. The briefing tent smelled of dust and sweat, the kind of staleness that clung to every corner of the forward operating base. Maps lined the plywood walls, tacked down with tape and frayed by the constant movement of hands. The long table in the center was surrounded by soldiers slouched in folding chairs. The rifles leaned carelessly against their knees. The only sound came from the hum of the ceiling fans above, spinning with lazy defiance against the desert heat. Staff Sergeant Kincaid entered quietly, the Barrett across her back like an oversized shadow. She didn't need to announce herself. The room did that for her. Heads turned, conversations stalled. Some men straightened instinctively, not out of respect, but from curiosity like students, catching sight of someone who clearly didn't belong in their classroom. "Have a seat," the commander said without looking up from the map spread before him. Kincaid nodded once and took a chair near the far end of the table. The Barrett didn't fit neatly beside her, its long barrel stretching awkwardly past the legs of her chair. She set it down carefully, her hand lingering on the receiver, a moment before pulling back. The commander, Captain Halloran, continued his briefing. He pointed at red-marked ridges on the map, his finger tracing supply routes and choke points. His voice was clipped, matter of fact, the tone of a man who had repeated the same warnings 100 times. "Insurgents have been using high ground here and here," he said, tapping the map. "We've lost 3 patrols in the past month to long-range fire. Whoever they've got out there, he's good. Knows the terrain, knows patience." Kincaid listened, her expression neutral. Around her, the other soldiers leaned back in their chairs, some chewing gum, others idly cracking their knuckles. Their attention drifted in and out. They had heard it all before, too, but their focus sharpened again when Halloran gestured toward Kincaid. "This is Staff Sergeant Kincaid. She's been attached to us as a sniper." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Some men smirked. One raised his brows and muttered, "That's a sniper?" Another chuckled low enough to hide it behind his hand. Halloran either didn't notice or chose not to. He returned to the map. "Her job is overwatch. Long-range support. That ridge position yesterday? That's where you'll be posted next week, Kincaid." She gave a short nod. "Understood." It wasn't her voice that drew attention, but the way she said it flat, even, as though the assignment was neither daunting nor unusual. The same men who had snickered now exchanged looks, half mocking, half uncertain. When the briefing ended, chairs scraped against the floor and soldiers filed out. Kincaid rose last, slinging the Barrett onto her shoulder in one smooth motion. She moved toward the exit, but a voice stopped her. "You ever even fired that thing?" She turned slightly. A tall sergeant leaned against the table, arms crossed, a grin tugging at his mouth. Two others stood beside him, waiting for her answer, with barely concealed amusement. "Yes," Kincaid said simply. The sergeant laughed. "Sure, but I mean for real, not at paper, not at a range. Out here, that gun's not just heavy, it's useless, unless you know what you're doing." Kincaid's gaze met his, calm, unblinking. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She only said, "I know what I'm doing." The grin faltered slightly, replaced by a squint of curiosity. But before he could press further, she turned and walked out into the heat, leaving his words behind like dust. Outside, the sun had begun to fall, turning the sky into streaks of copper and fire. The base moved with the rhythm of evening patrols. Returning, vehicles rattling across gravel, the distant thud of helicopters touching down. Soldiers gathered in small knots, laughing, trading stories, their voices carrying across the yard. Kincaid passed them without pause. But their voices followed. Command must be desperate, sending her here. She won't last a week. Bet she can't even zero that scope. The sting of their words didn't reach her. They were predictable, almost rehearsed. She had lived this pattern too many times before doubt, dismissal, disbelief. She didn't resent it anymore. Doubt was the soil where her silence grew, and silence was always stronger than words. She found an empty corner near the supply sheds and set the Barrett across her lap. With slow precision, she unfolded the bipod, checked the bolt, and ran a cloth along the barrel. She didn't need to clean it. It was already spotless, but the ritual calmed her dot as she worked. Fragments of memory stirred, the wind-swept ranges of training camps, the long days of lying prone in fields until her muscles ached and her mind screamed to quit. The instructors who told her she was wasting her time, the classmates who bet against her making it through. They had underestimated her too, and yet she had stayed hour after hour, breath after breath, until the shot was perfect. That was why. She didn't answer the men now. Why she didn't snap back or try to earn their respect with words. Respect built on noise never lasted. The only respect worth having came in the silence after a shot. Later, as the sky deepened into night, the barracks filled with voices again. Cards slapped against tables, dice rattled in cups, music crackled faintly from a speaker someone had smuggled in. Kincaid sat on her bunk, the Barrett resting against the wall beside her. She moved with the same quiet precision as before, disassembling the scope, checking the glass, reassembling it with practiced care. The same two soldiers from earlier watched her from across the room. One leaned toward the other and whispered, loudly enough for her to hear, "She's polishing that thing like it's going to save her life." The other chuckled, more like she wants us to think it will. That gun's probably bigger than her. Their laughter wasn't cruel, but it was sharp enough to cut through the room. A few others joined in. Kincaid didn't look up. She finished. Her work locked the scope into place and set the Barrett down with quiet finality. Then she stretched out on the bunk, hands folded over her chest, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The laughter faded. One by one, the soldiers turned back to their games, their voices rising again. But in the silence of her own mind, she carried none of their noise. She carried only the stillness of a scope, the weight of breath, the memory of distance measured. In heartbeats, they underestimated her. They all did. And that was fine. Because when the time came, when the ridge outside the wire lit up with the crack of enemy fire, and men scrambled for cover, none of them would be laughing. They would be listening, waiting, and her silence would be the only sound they trusted. The tower was nothing more than a skeleton of metal beams, bolted together and swaying ever so slightly in the desert wind. It rose above the base like a sentry with tired bones, its platform shaded by a sheet of corrugated steel that did little to hold back the heat. From up there, the desert stretched endlessly in every direction, flat, open, merciless. Kincaid climbed the narrow ladder just after sunrise. The Barrett slung across her back, her pack clipped tight to her chest. The climb was awkward. The weapon was nearly as long as the ladder itself. But she moved with steady rhythm, each boot finding its rung, as though she had done it 100 times before. When she reached the top, the soldier on shift was already leaning against the rail, helmet off, squinting into the sun. His rifle rested across his lap, forgotten, as though the desert had long since convinced him nothing worth watching ever moved out there. "Your shift," he said, pushing himself upright. His eyes flicked to the Barrett, then back to her. "Good luck with that thing." Kincaid didn't reply. She simply nodded, set her pack down, and began unfolding the bipod of her rifle. The soldier shook his head with a chuckle and climbed down, leaving her alone in the stillness. The desert wasn't silent. Not really. It whispered constantly. The low moan of wind skimming across the sand, the faint buzz of distant insects, the metallic groan of the tower as it shifted in the heat. But compared to the barracks, compared to the constant hum of engines and voices inside the wire, it was silence. And silence suited her. She laid prone, elbows braced against the wooden planks, and brought her eye to the scope. The glass cut the horizon into clarity, every ripple of sand, every jagged rock, every shimmer of heat waves that distorted the distance. She scanned slowly, left to right, then back again, her breathing calm, her body motionless. Time passed. Differently in the tower. Minutes stretched like hours, hours dissolved into nothing. Most soldiers dreaded it. They lasted 20 minutes before their minds began to wander, 30 before their bodies grew restless. An hour felt like torture. But for Kincaid, time slowed in a way that sharpened her. She welcomed it. Down below, life continued. Soldiers passed beneath the tower, some glancing up, others ignoring her completely. From her perch, she heard fragments of conversation. "She's still up there?" "Yeah, been there all morning. What's she even looking for?" "There's nothing out there." They laughed, voices trailing into the wind. Kincaid didn't look down. She didn't need to. She knew their words were meant to fill the silence. They couldn't stand out. Her breathing matched the rhythm of the wind. Inhale, exhale. Every shift in the breeze mattered, even when there was nothing to shoot. The desert was her teacher, and every second she spent watching was another lesson learned. By noon, the sun hammered the tower like a relentless drum. Sweat rolled down her back beneath her vest. Her eyes burned, but she didn't pull away from the scope. She adjusted her position slightly, easing the cramp in her arm, then returned to her scan. Most soldiers would have tapped out by then, calling for relief. Boredom turned to frustration, frustration to carelessness. But for her, the longer she stayed, the more the desert revealed itself. She noticed patterns others would have missed: the way dust swirled differently when something moved beneath it, the way birds scattered unnaturally when disturbed. These were details that saved lives. At some point, another soldier climbed the ladder. His helmet was tilted back, his rifle slung loosely across his chest. He looked at her with a smirk. "You've been up here for hours," he said. "You trying to prove something?" "No," Kincaid said without lifting her eye from the scope. He chuckled. "Well, you look like a statue. Don't know how you're not losing your mind already." Kincaid adjusted the focus ring slightly. Patience isn't losing your mind. It's controlling it. The soldier frowned, unsure if she was mocking him or not. He shrugged and climbed back down, muttering something about robots with rifles. Evening crept in slowly. the sun bleeding red across the horizon. The desert cooled by degrees, the heat rising from the sand like steam. Shadows lengthened, stretching toward the base like black fingers. Kincaid remained in position, her eye to the scope, her breathing steady. That was when she saw it a flicker, barely noticeable, but there. On the far ridge, nearly 2 miles out, a shimmer that wasn't heat, a glint that didn't belong to sand or stone. For an instant, she thought it might have been her eyes, tired from hours of watching. But no, the glint came again, sharp, precise, too deliberate to be nature. Her finger brushed the trigger, but she didn't fire. Not yet. The distance was too great, the conditions not right. Firing without certainty was as dangerous as not firing at all. Instead, she made a mental note, traced the landmarks in her head, and adjusted the scope's markings ever so slightly. From below, laughter drifted up again. Soldiers gathering near the barracks, trading stories, mocking the ghost on the tower who never seemed to blink. They didn't see what she saw. They didn't hear the silence as she did. They didn't understand that patience wasn't idleness, it was preparation. When her relief finally arrived, hours after sunset, he looked at her with disbelief. "You've been up here all day?" he asked. "Yes. See anything?" Kincaid rose slowly, stretching stiff muscles. "Maybe," she said. The soldier frowned. "Maybe? That's it." She slung the Barrett across her back, descended the ladder with the same steady rhythm as before, and left him standing in the tower, staring out at a desert he would never really see. Back in the barracks, the mocking continued, though softer now, tinged with unease. "She's crazy. Staying up there that long. Doesn't blink, doesn't talk. She's like a machine." Kincaid ignored them. She laid the Barrett on her cot, unstrapped the bipod, and began cleaning it in silence. Her hands moved with the same rhythm as her breathing, calm and unhurried, because she knew what they didn't. Somewhere out there, on that ridge, another set of eyes had been watching. Another rifle had been waiting. And patience would decide. Which of them fired first? The radio crackled before dawn, its static slicing through the silence of the base. Soldiers stirred from cots, rubbing sleep from their eyes, their movements sluggish and uneven. But the tone in the operator's voice was sharp enough to wake anyone. "Intel confirms activity on the ridge." "Repeat, enemy movement on the ridge. Possible sniper team." The words hung in the air like the chill before a storm. Kincaid was already awake. She sat on the edge of her bunk, boots laced, Barrett leaning against her knee as though she'd known. The call was coming. She didn't move quickly or frantically like the others. She simply stood, slung the weapon across her shoulder, and made her way toward the door. Outside, the desert was still dark, the horizon painted in pale streaks of blue. The air carried a rare coolness that would vanish within the hour. Patrols were already scrambling into gear, squad leaders barking orders, radios buzzing with fragments of overlapping messages. The ridge loomed in the distance, a jagged shadow, cutting against the lightening sky. The platoon gathered in the operations tent, its canvas walls fluttering in the wind. Captain Halloran stood at the map table, his face stern, jaw tight. His finger pressed against the topography lines marking the ridge. "They've set up here. And here," he said, pointing at 2 elevated positions. "Elevation gives them overwatch of our patrol routes. They've already tested their range 1 round, landed just 50 yards short of the motor pool last night. They're zeroing in." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. The men shifted on their feet, some exchanging nervous glances. Everyone understood the math. At 2 miles out, the insurgents could strike with near impunity. Most rifles couldn't touch that range. "Sir," one soldier said, "if they're that far, what the hell are we supposed to do?" "We can't hit them," Halloran's gaze hardened. That's why Staff Sergeant Kincaid is here. Dozens of eyes turned toward her. Some skeptical, some dismissive, others desperate for a shred of confidence. She stood still, her face unreadable, the Barrett slung comfortably against her shoulder, as though it weighed nothing at all. One of the younger soldiers couldn't help himself. With all due respect, sir. Her? With that thing? He gestured toward the rifle, his disbelief barely restrained. A few others chuckled nervously, as though humor could smother their fear. Kincaid didn't flinch. She simply stepped forward, her voice calm. "Where's the wind station?" Halloran blinked. "East Tower. I'll need a spotter," she sighed. The tent went silent for a beat, the soldiers caught off guard by her certainty. Finally, Halloran nodded. "You'll have one. We'll rotate." Kincaid inclined her head slightly, then turned and left without another word. The climb to the East Tower was longer than it looked. The Barrett weighed heavy on her back, but she carried it like an extension of herself. The base below was alive. With motion vehicles repositioning, sandbags dragged into place. Soldiers hurrying between cover, as though the ridge itself were already watching Dot at the top. She unfolded the bipod and laid prone, the rifle stretching out before her like a beast ready to wake. She checked her scope, adjusted the dials, and settled into stillness. The desert unfolded in her glass. Ridges, rocks, a scattering of dry shrubs. And there on the far ridge was the faintest outline of movement. Small, careful, intentional. Dot, her spotter, a corporal who looked barely old. Enough to shave, squinted through his binoculars beside her. "You really think that's them?" He whispered. Double quotes, "Yes," Kincaid replied. "How can you tell?" She adjusted her focus, breath steady. "Because nothing in the desert moves against the wind." The corporal lowered his binoculars, puzzled. But when he looked again, he saw what she meant. A tiny flicker of shape sliding into position, deliberate, against the natural flow of dust and breeze. "Holy shit," he breathed. "That's definitely a scope." Kincaid said nothing. She simply shifted, aligning her rifle, marking distance, feeling the rhythm of the wind tugging against her cheek. She could sense the other sniper, as though they were already locked in. A duel, each waiting for the other to make the first mistake. Back at the barracks, tension thickened. Soldiers avoided open spaces, moving quickly between cover. Jokes that once targeted Kincaid faded into silence. Now, no one laughed. The enemy had become real, the threat undeniable. Whispers passed like wildfire. "They're really out there. 2 miles away, and they can pick us off. What the hell are we supposed to do if she misses?" Fear has a way of stripping bravado. The same men who had dismissed her now spoke of her in hushed tones, not with respect yet, but with the reluctant awareness that their survival might hinge on her trigger finger. Hours crawled by. The sun rose higher, earning the ridge in sharp relief. Kincaid remained motionless in the tower, eyes fixed on her scope. Sweat traced lines down her temples, her muscles stiffened with stillness. But she didn't waver. Her spotter fidgeted, adjusting binoculars, shifting his weight. Finally, he whispered, "How do you stay like that? Hours without moving?" Kincaid's voice was soft, steady. "Because moving isn't the same as living. Up here, stillness keeps you alive." The corporal swallowed, his hands tightening on the binoculars. He stopped shifting. He tried to match her silence, though it unsettled him. Late in the afternoon, another flash glinted from the ridge. The corporal's breath caught. "There, you see it?" "Yes," Kincaid murmured. Through her scope, she watched. Not firing, not yet. The glint was a scope. The shadow beside it a spotter. 2 figures, professional, patient. "They're waiting," she said. "For what?" The corporal asked. "For us to be careless." Her words sank into him like stones, dropped into a well. He looked away from the binoculars, scanning the base below. Soldiers moved between buildings, laughing nervously, some removing helmets in the shade. Carelessness. Targets waiting to happen. Kincaid kept her eye on the ridge. She could feel the weight of the dual building, the inevitable clash of patience. Against patience, the enemy sniper wasn't reckless. He was good. Maybe as good as her, but patience was her domain. And she would not break first. That night, the base dimmed its lights, blackout curtains drawn tight. The ridge loomed darker than ever, a jagged mouth waiting to bite. Soldiers lay awake in their bunks, ears straining for a shot they prayed wouldn't. Come dot in the tower, Kincaid stayed prone, Barrett steady, her breath matching the desert's rhythm. The spotter dozed beside her, jerking awake every so often, muttering apologies. She didn't need him awake. She was awake enough for both of them. The ridge whispered promises of violence. The air held the weight of inevitability. The threat had emerged, and it was only a matter of time before the silence shattered. The desert was unnaturally still. Not quiet, never quiet, but still, as though every sound hung suspended in the air. The hum of insects, the hiss of wind dragging across sand, the faint creak of the tower's steel, all of it blended into a single rhythm. A rhythm Kincaid could hear as clearly as her own breath. She lay prone on the tower floor, cheek pressed against the stock of the Barrett. The rifle stretched out in front of her, massive, immovable, its weight digging into the wood through the bipod. She didn't fight the weight. She embraced it. The Barrett wasn't meant to be light. It was meant to end things. Her spotter, the young corporal, shifted beside her, binoculars glued to his eyes. He muttered under his breath, nervous, as though the words would keep him steady. They're still there. Haven't moved. Jesus, they're just lying there waiting. Good, Kincaid said softly. The corporal blinked. Good? Yes, waiting is the game. Whoever breaks first loses. She adjusted the scope slightly, her gloved fingers turning the dial in precise, measured clicks. Through the glass. The ridge sharpened into focus. Heat waves rippled, bending the horizon, but her eyes filtered through the distortion. And there, barely visible, was the shimmer of metal. The enemy's rifle. The enemy's eye. The corporal sucked in a breath. That's him, Kincaid exhaled. That's him. The challenge wasn't spotting the target. It was everything else: the math of distance, the physics of wind, the inevitability of bullet drop. At 3,200 meters, a shot wasn't just a shot. It was a calculation written in fractions of inches, seconds, and heartbeats. She studied the wind flag whipping lazily below the tower. The breeze was cross-range, steady but unpredictable in its shifts. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling it on her cheek, mapping its rhythm in her mind. She had learned long ago that numbers mattered, but instinct mattered more. Range, 3,200, the corporal whispered, as though confirming what her body already knew. She didn't nod. She didn't need to. Her breathing slowed, her pulse steadied, her mind narrowing to the space inside the scope. Everything else, the corporal, the base, the men below, even the weight of her own doubts, faded until there was nothing but her and the ridge. Through the glass, the enemy sniper was a ghost, motionless, patient, a reflection of herself perhaps. She wondered if he was watching her tower, if he felt the same tightening of focus, if his spotter whispered the same numbers into his ear. It was a duel, but not of speed, not of strength, of patience. And patience was her territory. The corporal shifted again, nerves rattling him. Should we call this in? Maybe artillery. No, Kincaid whispered. But no. Her voice wasn't sharp, but final. The corporal swallowed his words. Artillery would miss. Drones would take too long. And in the meantime, every soldier walking between buildings was a target. The sniper on that ridge would own the base until someone stopped him. Until she stopped him. Minutes dragged. The sun rose higher, burning the sand into blinding glare. Sweat stung her eyes, but she didn't blink. She couldn't. The Barrett was steady against her shoulder, its weight a promise. The corporal's voice was a tremor. I think he sees us. Kincaid breathed in, slow, out slower. Through the scope, she saw the faintest flicker of movement, the enemy shifting, adjusting, maybe even aiming. Time was collapsing. Patience was reaching its end. On my mark, she murmured, though she wasn't speaking to him. The world narrowed to a single breath. She inhaled. The barrel rose with her lungs. She exhaled. The barrel lowered, steadied, aligned. The crosshairs settled on the faint shimmer of glass, the enemy scope. A perfect circle. A perfect target. Her finger curled against the trigger. A feather's. Weight of pressure. The Barrett roared. It wasn't just sound. It was force. The rifle kicked against her shoulder like a hammer, the platform beneath her shuddering with the recoil. The blast cracked across the desert like thunder. The bullet cut the distance in silence, invisible but unstoppable. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. 3 seconds of unbearable stillness, the kind that made the corporal gasp. Did? You miss. Then it came. A flash on the ridge. A body crumpling. A scope shattering into fragments that caught the sunlight. Hit. Confirmed. The radio crackled seconds later. Ridge position neutralized. Repeat. Ridge position neutralized. The corporal let out a breath he'd been holding for minutes. Holy shit. Holy. He laughed, half hysterical, shaking his head. You actually hit it. You actually. Kincaid didn't smile. Didn't laugh. She simply pulled back from the scope, ejected the spent casing, and caught the faint curl of smoke rising from the chamber. To her, it wasn't glory. It wasn't disbelief. It was the inevitable conclusion of patience and preparation. But the base didn't see it that way. When she descended the tower, soldiers stared openly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Men who had dismissed her days ago now looked as though they had seen a ghost walk among them. 3,200 meters. Someone whispered, "Bullshit," another said automatically. But the words had no weight. They had all heard the radio. They had all seen the sudden silence on the ridge. No one could deny it. She walked past them without a word, the Barrett steady against her shoulder, her expression unchanged. She didn't need to explain. The number would do it for her. That night, when the air cooled and the base settled into uneasy rest, Captain Halloran called her forward. The men gathered, some still skeptical, others awed, all waiting for confirmation. From a small case, Halloran withdrew a badge. Simple metal, engraved with the number, 3,200. He handed it to her in silence. And in silence, she accepted. The men who had mocked her now stared as though frozen. Jokes died in their throats. The badge was proof. More than any story, more than any rumor. It was history in their hands. Kincaid pinned it quietly to her vest, then returned to her cot. She didn't celebrate. She didn't need to, because the desert never celebrated. It only remembered. And now, so would they. Asterisk the morning after the shot, the base felt different. It wasn't quieter. Machines still rumbled. Boots still thudded. Radios still hissed with chatter, but the air carried something else. A shift, a weight. Men who once joked in the chow line now spoke in hushed tones, leaning close, eyes flicking toward her table before darting away. They tried to disguise it, the sideways glances, the muttered words, but it spread faster than any rumor. 3,200 meters. The number had a gravity of its own. Every man in uniform, understood what it meant. 1.5 miles, a distance so far that most rifles couldn't even dream of reaching. And yet, yesterday, Staff Sergeant Kincaid had stared through a scope, pulled the trigger, and erased the threat that had held the entire base hostage. She sat alone at the edge of the mess tent, tray untouched. Barrett leaned against the wall beside her. The weapon drew stares almost as much as she did, as though it weren't just steel and polymer, but some mythic relic. The corporal, the same boy who'd spotted for her, slid onto the bench across from her. His face was still pale, his movements jittery, but his eyes burned with the memory of what he had seen. "They don't believe it," he whispered, leaning close. "Half of them think it was luck. The other half think, well, they don't know what to think." Kincaid's gaze lifted from her untouched food. "It doesn't matter what they believe," the corporal blinked. "How can you say that? You made the shot of a lifetime." "People need to believe what helps them sleep," she interrupted gently. The words silenced him. He stared at her a moment longer, then nodded, as though he understood something deeper than her calm voice allowed. Later that day, Captain Halloran called a formation in the motor pool. Soldiers stood in rows, heat pressing down from above, sweat dripping into their collars. Kincaid was called forward. She walked without haste, her Barrett slung at her side. She didn't march with ceremony, didn't stand tall as though demanding recognition. She simply walked as she always did, steady, deliberate, unshaken. Halloran held a small silver badge between two fingers. The number was etched plainly, 3,200. "This," he said, his voice carrying across the formation, "is not given lightly. It is not awarded for stories or rumors or boasts. It is earned with proof. Yesterday, Staff Sergeant Kincaid gave us proof." The rows shifted. Men exchanged glances, disbelief wrestling with awe. Halloran pinned the badge onto her vest, his hand lingering for a moment. "Let this remind every man here what discipline and patience can achieve. The ridge belongs to us again, because of her." The silence that followed was heavier than applause. Men who had mocked her days ago now stared as though seeing her for the first time. Their faces carried the weight of respect they hadn't known they could feel. Some tried to clap, but it felt hollow in the dry air. The truth was simpler. The badge was enough. That night, around the barracks, the story spread like wildfire. 3.2 clicks, one soldier whispered, eyes wide. "No way. Wind alone should have thrown it off." "Kid in the tower saw it," said the scope shattered. Said the guy dropped like a sack of rocks. And she didn't even flinch after. Men gathered in corners, retelling details, embellishing where they lacked clarity. But none of them questioned the outcome. The badge glinted on her vest. That was proof enough. Yet Kincaid herself stayed apart. While the others talked, she cleaned her rifle with the same precision she always had, her hands moving with quiet ritual. To her, nothing had changed. One shot, one target. That was the job. But even she felt it, the silence, when she entered a room. The way voices dropped, the way eyes followed her as though trying to solve the riddle of her calm. The corporal found her again by the watchtower. He hesitated before speaking. "Do you ever feel it?" he asked. Kincaid glanced at him. "Feel what?" "The weight, knowing you did something no one else could. Knowing everyone looks at you different now." She returned her eyes to the horizon. "The weight isn't in the shot. It's in what comes after." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She was silent for a moment. Then, "Every man I've put down was looking at someone else through his scope. Maybe he never pulled the trigger. Maybe he never would have. But the moment I do, the choice is gone. That's the weight, not the distance, not the badge. The choice." The corporal swallowed hard. He'd expected her to speak of glory or pride or even fear. Instead, she spoke of burden. And that, somehow, made her seem larger than the legend she'd become. 2 days later, supply convoys rolled safely across the valley. Patrols moved without fear of being watched through a hostile scope. The ridge was silent now, its threat erased. The base still remembered. Every time someone passed Kincaid in the corridors, conversations faltered. Men straightened unconsciously, as though in the presence of something beyond rank. Some offered nods of respect, small gestures to acknowledge the unspoken. Others simply stared, frozen in the disbelief of having witnessed history. She didn't bask in it. She didn't reject it. She simply carried it, the badge resting on her vest, like a quiet truth. And though the men might never say it aloud, the silence itself was proof enough. Proof of the shot, proof of the patience, proof of the woman they had all underestimated. That night, lying in her bunk, she closed her eyes. The desert outside hummed with wind, carrying the memory of a ridge now empty, 3,200 meters. The number echoed in her mind, not as triumph, but as inevitability. The desert had asked a question. She had answered, "And tomorrow." It would ask again. Asterisk stories have a way of traveling faster than truth. By the end of the week, the ridge was just another scar of sand and rock, forgotten by most as convoys rolled freely and patrols walked unburdened. But what had happened on that ridge was anything but forgotten. In the barracks, men still whispered about it. 3,200 meters, they'd murmur, as though speaking the number too loud would make it less real. At the mess hall, soldiers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of her at her usual table, where she ate in silence, head down, Barrett resting against the wall beside her. She didn't speak of it. Didn't need to. The whispers filled the silence for her. But it didn't stop at the base. Reports traveled up the chain, polished by every officer who retold them. A routine sitrep became a note of extraordinary precision marksmanship. That note became a line in a briefing, one confirmed target at 3,200 meters. By the time it reached division headquarters, it was no longer just a report, it was a story, and stories had power. Within days, it spread from one outpost to another, from squad to platoon, from battalion to brigade. Troops miles away spoke of a woman sniper who had dropped an enemy from 2 miles with a single shot. Some said it was luck. Others swore it was skill. Many added details that had never happened, that she'd fired through a sandstorm, that the enemy had been mid-trigger pull, that she'd taken the shot blind. Rumor sharpened her into myth. Kincaid felt the shift long before she heard it spoken. To her face, soldiers who had once dismissed her with smirks now stood straighter when she passed, as though proximity to her steadiness might make them steadier too. Even the doubters couldn't hide their curiosity. One evening, in the motor pool, a sergeant approached her while she checked her weapon. He cleared his throat, awkward in the silence. "Staff Sergeant," he said, I heard about the shot." Kincaid didn't look up. "Everyone's heard about the shot," he chuckled nervously. "Yeah, but I wanted to hear it from you. What was it like?" Her hands never paused, cloth sliding down the long barrel of the Barrett. She considered his question, then finally said, "Like breathing." The sergeant frowned, unsure how to respond. She offered nothing else. She didn't need to. Still, the questions grew. Men sought her out between patrols, asking if she'd really done it, if the stories were true. Some were reverent, others skeptical, but all wanted something from her: validation, inspiration, proof that the impossible was real. She gave them little. A nod, a quiet yes, sometimes nothing at all. The story belonged to them now. Whatever they made of it wasn't her concern. But inside, she felt the ground shifting. The shot had not just ended a threat. It had created something larger than her, something she couldn't control. One night, the corporal who had spotted for her returned to her side in the tower. He had grown quieter since that day, less jittery, more watchful. "They're talking about you at HQ," he said softly, lowering his binoculars. "Heard an officer say your name in the same breath as Hathcock and Furlong." She didn't answer. "You know what that means?" He pressed. "Yes," she said finally. "It means you're a legend." Kincaid's eyes stayed on the horizon. "Legends aren't people. They're stories. And stories don't carry rifles. People do." The corporal frowned, trying to parse her meaning. But she let the silence hold, her gaze never leaving the endless desert beyond the wire. Weeks passed. Supply lines held. Patrols grew bolder. The base no longer flinched at the thought of eyes watching them from a ridge. But with every convoy that returned safe, the whispers grew. Letters home carried her name. "There's a woman here who made a shot so far you wouldn't believe me. If I wrote it." Calls home carried it too. Soldiers telling their families of the sniper who had turned fear into silence. The legend of Kincaid spread stateside, filtering into barracks in Fort Bragg, Fort Hood, Camp Pendleton. At first it was disbelief, then fascination, then pride. In a nation hungry for stories of heroism, hers was a feast. One morning, Halloran found her in the armory. Barrett disassembled across the bench. "They're asking for you," he said. Kincaid didn't look up. "Who's they?" "Brigade staff, maybe higher. They want interviews, reports, the details of the shot." She paused, hands still, then continued reassembling the weapon. "The details are already written." The round left the chamber. The target fell. That's all. Halloran exhaled. "You know, it's more than that. They want the story. Soldiers need it. The country needs it." She locked the upper receiver into place, the click echoing in the armory. "Then let them tell it." He studied her a moment, then nodded, understanding the finality in her voice. The following week, a journalist embedded at another base wrote a small piece about a mysterious sniper who broke records. No name, just rumor. It spread anyway, faster than any official briefing could contain. Somewhere, in a diner back in Kansas, an old veteran read the story and shook his head in disbelief. In a college dorm, a cadet taped the article above his desk for inspiration. In living rooms across the country, families retold the tale, each adding their own awe to the number. 3,200 meters. And still, Kincaid remained silent. She walked the same dust-blown paths, ate the same cold rations, kept watch over the same valley. For her, nothing had changed, but for everyone else, everything had. Late one night, when the base had quieted and even the wind seemed hushed, the corporal asked her again, "Doesn't it bother you that the story's out there, and it's not really yours anymore?" She thought for a long moment before answering. "No," she said, "because the story isn't what keeps this base safe. The shot did. And tomorrow, if another ridge hides another scope, I'll take another shot. The story will follow, but the work stays here." The corporal nodded slowly, understanding at last. The whispers would continue. The myth would grow. The name would spread. But Kincaid would remain what she had always been: steady, deliberate, unshaken. Because legends lived in stories. And she still lived in the desert. Legends rarely end where they begin. The ridge had long since gone quiet. The enemy never returned to it, never again tried to set up their rifles on its jagged spine. Convoys passed freely. Patrols walked without fear of distant glass eyes watching from the hills. Life on the base settled back into its old rhythms. Drills at dawn, heat at noon, restless sleep at night. But something invisible lingered. It wasn't in the dust or the barracks or the watchtowers. It was in the way men carried themselves. Straighter, firmer, a little less afraid. and always aware of the woman who walked among them with calm steps and an impossible story strapped to her shoulder. The badge pinned to her vest became its own kind of silence. She never touched it, never spoke of it, but it spoke for her. To some, it was proof of skill. To others, proof of luck. To all, it was proof that the impossible could be done. The younger soldiers watched her most. Kids, barely out of training, still carrying nerves in their eyes, still learning how to breathe in a fight. They studied how she walked, how she carried her rifle, how she never seemed rushed. One night, a private asked her directly, "How do you do it, Staff Sergeant? How do you stay calm?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable, then said, "Only discipline. Everything else follows." The private nodded, not sure he understood, but he wrote the word in his notebook later that night, as though it were scripture. The story spread far beyond the wire. By then, it had taken on a life of its own. Some said she had killed 2 men with 1 round. Others swore she'd fired uphill through shifting crosswinds. A few claimed she'd used a prototype rifle no one else had ever touched. The numbers changed. 2. Some said 3,200 meters. Others swore it was 3,500. Each retelling stretched the distance until the shot no longer belonged to Earth, but to myth. Kincaid let it all pass. To her, the truth was simple. 1 shot, 1 ridge, 1 silence bought. For the men she served beside. The rest was noise. But noise had power. It reached Pentagon halls, where generals spoke of a demonstration of American precision unmatched in modern conflict. It reached cable news, where pundits debated the morality of long-range kills. It reached living rooms, where families clutched coffee mugs and whispered, "Did you hear about her?" Her name was spoken less than the number. 3,200 meters. That was the headline. That was the myth. And yet, in the base where the shot was fired, her name mattered more than any number. Months later, when her tour ended, she packed her kit without ceremony. The Barrett went into its case, the badge into its pouch, the desert dust into the seams of her boots. The men gathered quietly near the transport trucks, watching her. Some offered salutes, others handshakes, a few only nods. None made jokes, none called her lucky. The corporal who had spotted for her approached last. He was taller now somehow, or maybe just steadier. "You changed everything," he said softly. She shook her head. The ridge was the same. The desert was the same. The work was the same. But we weren't the same, he insisted. She studied him for a moment, then allowed herself the faintest of smiles. Then carry that forward. It was the closest thing to a farewell she gave. Back home, the world tried to claim her story. Invitations came for interviews, for speeches, for profiles in glossy magazines. She declined them all. When pressed, she gave the same answer. The shot was the work. The story is yours. The legend grew louder without her voice. And yet, those who had stood beside her knew better. They carried the truth quietly, that she had never asked for glory, that she had never boasted, that she had only ever done what was required. In the end, that truth mattered more than the myths. Years later, young recruits at sniper school would hear the tale of the woman who had taken the impossible shot. Some instructors treated it as cautionary proof that patience mattered more than firepower. Others told it as inspiration, that no distance was too great if discipline guided the hand. The recruits would whisper about her, trading versions of the story. Was it luck? Was it skill? Did it even really happen? And somewhere, one of the men who had been on that base would quietly confirm, "I saw it. I was there." And no, she didn't smile. Not once. That was the version that survived longest. The truth of her silence. The desert eventually forgot her. Sand-buried footprints. Wind erased echoes, sun bleached the rocks. But men carried memory better than stone got in every barracks she had passed through. In every platoon that had shared her story, her name lingered like an ember dot, not for the badge, not for the number, not even for the shot, but for the way she had carried herself steady, deliberate, unshaken dot, because in the end, that was her legacy, dot, not the distance, not the myth, not the whispers, but the discipline that made all of it possible. And long after the last convoy rolled, after the war itself blurred into history, one truth remained whenever her name was spoken. They had assumed she was just carrying a Barrett, until the silence of a 3,200-meter kill proved otherwise. And that silence never left them.